So let's go ahead. Firstly, is our introduction on the ToBe project. ToBe is a Horizon 3-year project focusing on understanding a transition towards a sustainable well-being society and economy. The project focuses on the creation of an economic model based on the concept of well-being, of sustainable well-being and the well-being economy. It is currently working on some case studies and the modeling of the economic model, as well as some working on some indicators. And at the end of this, we will focus as well on the co-creation aspect of it with the Wellbeing Economy Lab. And we have some interesting things coming up in the project. We have just published the policy brief, which you can find in our website, as well as we are about to host a workshop on sufficiency, about which Éloi has more information. Maybe he can share it during his introduction, as well as the next Time ToBe Blooming webinar that will take place in May. So yeah, without further ado, let's start with the presentation. Firstly, we have Éloi Laurent. He's a senior research fellow at FCE, professor at the School of Management and Innovation at Sciences Po, and visiting professor at Stanford University. He was a former aide in the French Parliament and for the French Prime Minister, and he has been a visiting scholar at NYU, Columbia University, and Harvard Center for European Studies. Some of his recent publications include The New Environmental Economics, Sustainable and Justice, The Wellbeing Transition, Analysis and Policy, and Towards Social Ecological Wellbeing, Rethinking Sustainability and Economics for the 21st Century. So I give you the floor, Éloi, for introducing the workshop and also your intervention.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria. Can you hear me well? Yeah?
We can hear you well, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Maybe we can skip to the next slide, although I really like my photograph, but yeah, okay, thank you very much. So the presentation is going to be a bit different from the one I gave in the Beyond Growth event, because otherwise it wouldn't be fun. But it's going to be in the same spirit. So first, let me say that on Thursday, this Thursday, we are organizing at Sciences Po a workshop, a full-day workshop on the social and ecological dimension of the Green Deal, which is funded by ToBe. And so I would like to thank the organizers for allowing us to organize this workshop. We're going to have great people talk. So if you want to just take a look at the program, you go on the Sciences Po website and you will see and you will see the program for this workshop. So it's going to be related to that. I'm going to talk about, because this is the theme of this session, on the relation between the EU Green Deal and the upcoming European elections. I'm going to do this based on two papers that are going to be published in the next few weeks. The first one is the one I already talked about in this Beyond Growth event, which is a paper written with Julia Steinberger and Yamina Saeb, which is supposed to be published on Europe Day, so May 9, by the European Parliament, at least by the Green Group of the European Parliament, and it's called a blueprint for a European Social and Green Deal. I say that it should be published because there are some uncertainties due to the electoral context. And I'm going to talk about briefly at the end about another paper that we are writing with my colleague Jérôme Kriel and Emma Lavsière on some indicators for the Green Deal and to try to measure where we are in terms of achieving the Green Deal. So this is what I'm going to do. First, let me start with the context. The political debate in Europe today is very much that the Green Deal is under threat, possibly in jeopardy, because of a, let's say, popular social revolt against environmental policies, and that basically the next European elections might be a huge obstacle in terms of their outcome for the Green Deal, and that conservative and And far-right parties might want to simply dismantle the Green Deal. And so the mood, I would say, in Brussels and elsewhere in EU member states is that this is a time of danger for the Green Deal. I have to say I don't share this pessimism about the future of the Green Deal, and for a number of reasons. The first reason is that the Green Deal has already, let's say, has already been hit by a number of accidents. If you think about the beginnings of the Green Deal, when the Green Deal is announced, COVID-19 is already on the European soil. We don't know it, but we will know it a few months later. And so there is this first accident in the sense of the COVID-19 pandemic derailing the Green Deal for at least a year. And then the Green Deal has been able to recover. And so I think it's a testimony to the resilience of the Green Deal. Then after that, as soon as the Green Deal escapes the COVID pandemic, you have the Russian aggression in Ukraine, which again is supposed to derail and even terminate the Green Deal, and the inflation shock and the social shock that results from the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And again, you don't see that. On the contrary, the Green Deal accelerates after that, and the year where the Green Deal really, I would say, accelerates in terms of legislative achievement is precisely 2022. So I think that the Green Deal has proven its resilience through those shocks. And so I think that there might be an electoral shock come June, but I think it's an overstatement to think that it's going to be the end of the Green Deal. And I will also like to remind you that the Green Deal itself is an accident. It's a political accident. It was in no one's electoral platforms, actually, in June of 2019, and it's the result of an improbable political agreement with the center-right and the center-left and the Renew Party, an agreement, a sort of coalition agreement in which actually the Greens didn't take part in. So I think that the Green Deal itself is a political accident. And the question is that it's an accident that's becoming, or I would say a happy accident, that's becoming a structural policy in the EU. And I think that it's actually here to stay. And so the real question is not the end of the Green Deal. The real question is the transformation of the Green Deal into a social and Green Deal so that it is fair and it is well accepted. And because of that, it is really sustainable. So let me turn to the presentation. So Maria, please, next slide. So the outline, I'm sorry, you will have to go down the slides each time because you control the slides. So I will talk about the fact that the Green Deal is under attack by what I call anti-ecological populism. And I will try to debunk this fear that anti-ecological populism is going to be the end of the EU Green Deal. Then I will stress the need to really focus on Europeans and their lives to actually build a social and Green Deal, to start from the lives of Europeans. Then I will try to develop the social ecological approach that we have let's say, built with Julia and Yamina. And then I will talk about this other study on the need to rebalance the Green Deal, the European Green Deal, not just with the social dimension, but actually within the existing European Green Deal to balance the energy climate part with the other parts of the Green Deal. So next slide, please. So first, if you take the European mandate, which is ending next June, it's really, in the sense, it begins with a social ecological revolt and it ends with a social ecological revolt. So you have the yellow vest in 2018, 2019, which are going to scare all of European policymakers in really convincing them that, you know, environmental policy is being rejected by the European population and that it's basically impossible to conduct environmental policy and that you should be very careful and very, prudent with environmental policy. So that's the yellow vest narrative. And then you end the mandate with the 2024 so-called farmers' revolt, not just in France, but also in Germany, Spain, Belgium, Austria, where again, the idea is that you have a sort of social revolt or popular revolt against environmental policy, which is supposed to mean that environmental policy in the EU is something that comes at the high cost when it comes to social inequality and political support. So please. So there are two key arguments of anti-ecological populism. The first argument is that, well, the environmental emergency is not really the key emergency. And so the key emergency is really with identity or with immigration or with Islam. And so that environmental emergency has to take a backseat to those real emergencies for the people. So the people would put identity emergency, in a sense, ahead of environmental emergency. That's the first argument. It's certainly what we are hearing in France today. And the second key argument is that the social emergency is incompatible with environmental emergency. And so you have a number of populist movements today weaponizing social emergency against environmental emergency. And we certainly have seen that with the farmers' revolts, okay? So next, yeah, thank you. So those positions, which are really ideological positions, are presented as popular demands, as something that citizens want in the EU and that you need to abide by because basically it's democracy and you need to hear the concern of the people in democracies. So next point. My problem with that is that it's not well supported by surveys. If you look at the Eurobarometer of the fall 2023, so 6 months before the election, the key priorities were the fight against poverty and social exclusion, public health, and climate crisis mitigation. So basically, you have those social and ecological priorities very high on the list of European priorities, and the question of identity, immigration, Islam is really not that high. This is the Eurobarometer. You have the Eurobarometer of fall of 2022, where you have a huge majority of EU citizens that support a green transition, provided that this transition is fair. And I think this is the key question. How do you articulate the green transition with social justice? How do you make it a social ecological transition? And it's also a question which is at the heart of the ToBe project, which is how do you articulate the question of environmental policy and social policy? How do you articulate human well-being with sustainability? That's the real question. The question is not to pit one against the other, because the two are actually key priorities for Europeans. And this is the Eurobarometer, but if you look at the recent Hertie School Jacques Delors Center study with a lot more respondents and a big panel in France, Germany, and elsewhere, you don't see this climate fatigue, and they are actually debunking the idea that people in Europe don't want European policy because they think that basically it's going to ruin their livelihood. On the contrary, I think that the climate crisis is very high on the agenda of EU citizens. So once again, the question is how to reconcile the two instead of how to pit one against the other. And if you look at the European model or the European identity in the long run, let's say in the last 30 or 40 years, you see very clearly those two pillars. Europe in the last 30 or 40 years, at least since the early 1990s, was built on the one hand with a commitment for social justice. This is very clear, and this is a key feature of the European Union when compared to the US. And on the other hand, it was also built on the idea of sustainability. You need to keep in mind that the first ever proposal for carbon tax at, let's say, a high public authority level was the proposal by the European Commission in 1992. So I think you see sustainability everywhere in European treaties. And so I think not just with respect to the aspirations of the citizens of the European Union, but also with respect to the features of the European model or European identity, it makes a lot of sense to try to combine social justice and sustainability. Hence, the idea that, yes, the European Green Deal is not perfect and the social dimension is weak, but again, the idea is not to get rid of the environmental policy is to try to invent a new social ecological policy. Hence the need to make it a social and Green Deal rather than just a Green Deal. Next slide, please. So our core arguments in the paper with Julia Steinberger and Yamina Saeb is first that the EU needs a genuine European path toward a Green Deal, which is aligned with the core European values and with Europeans' aspirations of social justice and environmental responsibility. And again, I think you can make the case that this is what Europeans want, and this is in line with the EU's history. The reason I say genuine European path is that there is a temptation to imitate the US IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, which has nothing to do with reducing inflation or very little to do with reducing inflation, contrary to its name, but has everything to do with a sort of environmental industrial policy. And there is this idea that now the Green Deal should move towards the industrial phase. That was very clear in the speech made by Ursula von der Leyen on the next step for the Green Deal, which is to industrialize the Green Deal. And there you see the Biden administration's influence on EU policymakers. And the idea would be that we need industrial policy to basically compete with the US. I think that this is not aligned with European values. I'm not saying it doesn't make sense and we don't need industrial policy, but I think European values have to do again with social justice. And so I think it makes sense to work on this path. Next point, please. The EU also needs consistent and coherent social ecological policies instead of, again, this idea that you try to compensate by social policy the detrimental effect that you did not anticipate from environmental policy. So that's the compensation part, and this is very present in the Green Deal as it is. Social policy is there in the form of trying to compensate for instance, adverse distributional effect, but why not build social ecological policies from the onset rather than try to make for not so well-designed environmental policy? Again, I'm not arguing that environmental policy cannot have adverse social effects, but I'm saying that you can anticipate those and build and design policies so that they are social ecological. And certainly the case with carbon taxation, for instance. Next point, please. Okay, so one of the big arguments that we are trying to make in the paper is that there is a sort of, let's say, misunderstanding about the situation right now and the interplay between ecological transition on the one hand and social inequality on the other. The argument that I'm hearing over and over again is that the ecological transition is going to create social inequality that people are going to revolt against, and this is basically unsustainable, and we shouldn't allow for it. And this is going to be politically unsustainable. The reality is that the ecological transition that is required in terms of the energy systems, in terms of natural resource consumption, in terms of biodiversity preservation, on the scale where it's needed, it has barely started. And so the social inequality that we are witnessing really stem from the non-transition. And so there was a famous paper that was really quoted over and over again on the cost of non-Europe, the Cecchini report. And for decades, it was argued that member states were paying a cost of non-Europe in the sense of markets not being integrated enough. And that was a major cause of inefficiency. I think now we can make the case for a cost of non-transition. What we are seeing, especially, and this is why the farmers revolt, in a sense, is really misleading. Farmers are revolting not against the hypothetical, regulation of the Green Deal, which have not basically taken place yet. They are really revolting against the non-transition of the farming model in the EU. And this is very clear in France. And the lobbies that were defending farmers are the lobbies of inertia, are the lobbies that have precisely put farmers in a position where everything is unsustainable. Their social situation, their income, the level of debt, the soil exhaustion, the biodiversity destruction, the health cost, the cost on ecosystems. There's not one single aspect of the farming model in France which is sustainable. And this is not due to environmental regulation. It's due to the non-transition. And so I think we should really start from this situation, from the reality of the social and ecological predicament for Europeans in their daily lives. And from there on, imagine social ecological policy rather than fantasize a sort of environmental policy which would translate into unbearable social inequality. This is not the case. Inequality today is the result of non-transition, not the result of transition. It's the result of the lack of transition. And this is why we see this incredible rates in energy poverty, in food and housing insecurity, and in health vulnerability. This is not due to an excess of environmental policy, really. Okay, next slide, please. So what we did in the paper, what we do in the paper is to start with the lives of Europeans. A long time ago in a distant galaxy, when you did tax analysis and you didn't have those huge data sets and those micro simulation models, you did it with case studies. And case studies was the fact of trying to imagine what was the effect of a given tax policy on a given household by detailing as much as you could the life of the household and try to imagine what would be the effect of a given tax policy. I think this, of course, was, in a sense, let's say, small-scale economic analysis, but it had one merit, which was to start with the lives of people that I think is very difficult to imagine when you are using large data sets. And so what we do in the paper is we are trying to imagine the lives of some Europeans that face the double penalty of social and ecological predicament. And so we start by those European profiles, because I think, but again, it's really important to focus on transition as it is experienced by people. And this is one of the contributions that we are trying to make in the paper, although it's probably just the beginning. So we start with those profiles, and then please, next slide. What we try to do is, on the one hand, we are trying to have well-being dimensions, so subsistence, security, participation, stability, what people would want, and then combine that with planetary boundaries, climate, biodiversity, ecosystem, resources, and then try to basically cross those two dimensions and using social ecological policies. So on the one hand, the major functions of social policies, which is provision, prevention and protection, promotion, transformation, and then the functions of ecological policies, which are mitigation, adaptation, restoration, and compensation. And by crossing those policies, trying to imagine what could be a policy that answers the social and ecological predicament of each European profiles that we have tried to outline in the paper. Hence the fact that you see the name of the people in the different boxes where you have this social ecological crossing. Okay, so this is something that has been inspired by the recent report of the High Committee on Just Transition commissioned by the Belgian government, in which already we were trying to have this sort of social ecological matrix, trying to, again, see how we can use environmental policy and social policy together, trying to address the issues in the lives of Europeans. I want to say a word here about, no, please, Maria, yeah, just thank you. I want to say a quick word on one of the ongoing debates that we are having in the EU right now. If you follow European debates, you probably know that there are two reports in the pipeline which is the one is already released, which is the Enrico Letta report. The other is in the making, which is the Mario Draghi report. And those two reports basically argue that the EU member states are basically experiencing a falling behind when it comes to economic competitiveness with respect to the US and China. Basically, the two reports make the same argument that European economies in the wake of the COVID-19 shock have been lagging behind, especially the US economy when it comes to GDP per capita, and even China, if I understood correctly. And in this respect, if I understand correctly, the argument is to say that we need competitiveness policies, and one of them is to integrate the single market even more, and especially the capital market, because this would be something that would accelerate economic growth in the EU. First of all, I think it's a very strange argument to make that the EU is lagging in capital market integration, because my understanding was that it's probably the domain where European integration has basically reached an unprecedented level. But then I think that in this perspective, when you are talking about competitiveness and economic growth and GDP per capita, you are completely missing the real comparative advantages of the EU and the EU member states in globalization. And for me, those advantages are really, on the one hand, the fact that we have developed social policies much more than everywhere else on the planet, and that we have also developed environmental policies much more than everywhere else on the planet. And so the real comparative advantages for me in this time that Simon is going to talk about of shocks and complex shocks, and if you've heard the news, there might be another pandemic shock that is developing because of the avian flu, where you have, if you have this social policy which is really developed, can buffer those shocks, and environmental policies also, and you are able to bring them together, I think it's a huge comparative advantage in globalization. And this is really what the EU should focus on, rather than, again, trying to imitate the US on the grounds of the US. GDP per capita is an indicator that was invented in the US in a very specific context, which is the context of Great Depression. And it was largely invented in the US to actually completely blur social inequality resulting from the Great Depression. So if we are going to compete with the US, let's not compete with the US on the grounds of the definition of prosperity by the US. Let's try to invent a European definition of well-being, and try to use our advantages for what they are, rather than trying to imitate the US, and not to talk about China, because to argue in 2024 that the EU should imitate China when you see the trajectory of the country, not just the economy, of course, but the political system and the civil society, for me, it's a really strange argument to make for the Europe of the 21st century. So I would rather focus on what are, the aspiration and values of EU member states, but also the strength of EU member states. Hence the need to build those synergetic social ecological policies. Next slide, please. So what we do is we are trying to start with those, this once again, crossing of human well-being and planetary boundaries. And then from that, we move to social ecological policies. And from that, we move to the European profiles that we have identified. This is pretty much a preliminary paper, in the sense of it needs more development, but I think it's promising. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are a number of conditions, of course, for the Green Deal to move into a social and a Green Deal. And the first condition is to have an idea of what would be the transformative framework of the European Green Deal as it is, and the social and Green Deal that we want and that we aspire to. I think you need to realize that we are not going to do away with what was achieved in terms of the Green Deal. We need to add to the Green Deal. So it's not going to be trying to just go back and relitigate all the legislation that is now becoming the law of the land, but it's more adding a layer to it. And so what we are trying to do is to say, okay, the Green Deal is basically 4 pillars. You have climate and energy, resource and pollution, food and agriculture, biodiversity and ecosystems. The Green Deal as it is climate neutrality, material efficiency, food sovereignty, and conservation. And we are adding a layer on that, which is a layer where you combine ecological and social goals. And so we have climate neutrality, but also equity, with the question of fuel poverty being front and center. We have material efficiency, but also sufficiency. And I hope that ToBe will make a great contribution in the field of sufficiency. And I think that sufficiency is really lacking in the current framework of the Green Deal. Food sovereignty, but also food security. Food insecurity is a much more important problem that we realize in the EU, and conservation, but also regeneration and protection from ecological shocks. So this is really the logic, is trying to build on the Green Deal rather than to completely, start from scratch, which I think doesn't make any sense. Okay. And my final slide. So my final slide is going to be a segue, I hope, to Simon's presentation, which is that I've referred to mostly in the presentation so far to the imbalance between environmental policy and social policy in the Green Deal. But I think there is another way to look at the Green Deal as it is and to envision progress after the June election, which is to, again, take those 4 pillars, climate and energy, biodiversity and ecosystem, food and agriculture, and resources and pollution, and try to see how far we have gone on the road to 2030 indicators. And so what we are trying to do in this paper that is going to be published in the beginning of May, so around the time when the paper on the social and Green Deal will be published with my colleagues, is to try to take the 13, 14 indicators that we have for the Green Deal, because believe it or not, there are not that as many indicators today that are clear and objective indicators of the Green Deal, which EU member states have agreed upon and that are in legislative text. And we are trying to take those indicators, divide the Green Deal into those 4 components, and see how much of the ground we have covered when it comes to 2030 indicators. And what we found out is that there is an imbalance in the Green Deal as it is achieved so far. If you take the latest data, we have covered 2/3 of the road from where we are now and where we should be in 2030 when it comes to climate and energy, but only about 30–35% when it comes to the other pillars. And why is this important? Because it means that, of course, the Green Deal at its core is to become the first climate neutral continent in the world. And so it's logical that climate and energy was really the priority. The problem is, I think the other 3 dimensions, the other 3 pillars of the Green Deal have been neglected. And in the end, it's going to cause a problem even for the core of the Green Deal, which is climate and energy. And I will give just one example. You need biodiversity and ecosystems which are vibrant in order to be able to face the climate shocks that we have. So in other words, if you have, for instance, carbon sinks, which are going to be degraded, and carbon sinks which are going to not be able to function as they should, how much you reduce your emissions is going to be meaningless in the end if you have a zero net emission strategy. So you need to have biodiversity and ecosystems vibrant in order to have zero emission net strategy that really works. All right. So I think this is the other imbalance in the Green Deal, which is the imbalance between the energy and climate pillar and the other 3. And I think it's also should be addressed in the aftermath of the June election. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Éloi. This was very interesting. I'm sure a lot of people have questions. I have questions, and I agree with almost everything that you have said. And I remind you that if you have any questions or remarks, to please write them down in the chat or raise your hand during the discussion session. So we move on to Simon's intervention. Simon Dekeyrel is a policy analyst in the Sustainable Prosperity for Europe program at the European Policy Center. He's currently finishing his PhD on the contemporary evolution of the EU energy policy at the University of Nottingham, where he was part of the EU Horizon 2020 Marie Skłodka Curie research project, EU trade and investment policy. Simon was a visiting researcher at Ghent University, the Egmont Institute, and the Energy Community Secretariat in Vienna. And his primary research interests are the EU internal and external energy and climate policy. I give you the floor, Simon.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. Also, good afternoon to everyone joining online. So yes, my name is Simon Dekeyrel. I'm a policy analyst at the European Policy Center as part of our Sustainable Prosperity for Europe program, or the what we call at DPC the Green Deal program. And today I will present the findings of our discussion paper, The Green Deal in Times of Polycrisis, Aligning Short-Term Responses with Long-Term Commitments, which was released at the end of February and which is available on the EPC's website. Next slide, please. So this discussion paper builds on the findings of the project Managing the Crisis of Today and Tomorrow, which was carried out in the course of 2023. And as part of this project, we sought to explore how in this era of polycrisis, with a continuous succession of crises since 2008, the global financial crisis, the EU sovereign debt crisis, the 2015 migration crisis, Brexit, the COVID-19 pandemic, and then, of course, the war in Ukraine and its repercussions for global and European energy and food systems, and now also the war in the Middle East, how in this international environment, the EU can keep the Green Deal on track and ultimately tackle the most fundamental of all crises, which is the triple planetary crisis of environmental pollution, biodiversity loss, and climate change. So this is, of course, not a matter of choice, but a necessity, as the Green Deal remains for Europe the only pathway towards long-term sustainable prosperity on the European continent. So as part of this project, we organized 2 events in 2023 and also undertook additional research, which led to 2 separate pieces on respectively the food crisis and the energy crisis following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which are also available on the EPC's website. And all of these activities fed into the discussion paper, which I'm presenting today. Next slide, please. So in this discussion paper, co-authored by myself and EPC colleagues, we explore the rationale, means, and tools to align short-term crisis responses with Green Deal objectives by studying how Europe's responses to past and ongoing crises have impacted the green and just transition in Europe. And specifically, we'll look at 4 case studies. First of all, the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, and ensuing EU sovereign debt crisis. Then also the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the energy crisis following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing European and global food crisis. And so for each of these case studies, we have first analyzed the impact of the crisis and also of the emergency measures that were taken at EU level and by member states on EU climate goals. And then we also consider what lessons can be drawn for EU policy to navigate this era of polycrisis in line with the Green Deal. Next slide, please. So what have you found? First of all, that there's a strong rationale for aligning our responses to short-term crisis with the long-term objectives of the Green Deal. The global financial and EU sovereign debt crisis, for instance, showcased the potential path dependencies that may arise from a disregard of the green agenda during times of crisis, with the decline of Europe's previously world-leading solar industry due to a lack of strategic investment, and then the subsequent rise of China at the start of the 2010s in the supply chains. And now, of course, the EU has become overwhelmingly dependent for all raw materials and components in these solar supply chains, which we are now trying to devise a response to as part of the Green Deal and industrial plan. But this is, of course, much easier said than done, also in the context of the IRA. So, and I know the same slides, yeah. And on the other hand, the global financial crisis and particularly the austerity measures that were taken in response to the EU sovereign debt crisis also show how insufficient consideration of social objectives, in addition to a disregard of the green agenda that we saw during the global financial crisis, can also lead to a rise in populism and societal polarization, which is, of course, far from trivial, as highlighted by the ongoing green backlash that we now see, and the rise in populist parties in the run-up to the European elections in June. But our paper also shows that crises do not have to result in backsliding on EU climate and environmental goals. As shown by the pandemic, and to some extent also by the energy crisis, resolute action at EU level and by member states can effectively deal with crises in the short term, and also transform crises into powerful catalysts for the green and just transition in Europe. We identify in our paper 3 key factors crucial in effective crisis management and aligning our responses to crisis in Europe with the Green Deal. First of all, EU leadership and strategic vision. As also mentioned by the previous speaker, the launch of the Green Deal shortly before the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic was able to steer Europe's crisis response towards contributing towards the green transition, where a lack of a similar strategic vision at EU level during the Eurozone crisis led to disregard of the green and the green agenda and also of social objectives. The Green Deal put sustainability at the center of EU crisis management during the pandemic. Similarly, Repower EU, launched by the Commission in response to the energy crisis following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, put forward, advanced the rollout of renewables as a key tool and solution to absorb the Russian supply shock. And this in turn significantly accelerated the deployment of especially solar capacity in the EU over the past 2 years. However, our findings also underline that EU leadership in times of crisis is not a given. And this can in turn significantly hamper net zero ambitions under the Green Deal. For instance, the lack of coordination at the European level during the energy crisis led to a patchwork of national emergency interventions by member states to protect consumers, both households and businesses, from soaring electricity and gas prices in Europe, and which in practice has often amounted to subsidies to fossil fuel consumption, because these financial compensation mechanisms often diminished incentives to save energy for consumers, and also diminished the incentives to switch to more sustainable energy alternatives, such as, for instance, by lowering taxation on gas consumption and on petrol prices, which took away lowered prices artificially, which in turn led to took away incentives for consumers to reduce their energy consumption during the energy crisis. Moreover, EU leadership and top-down strategic vision in itself is also not enough to align crisis responses with the Green Deal when it fails to be inclusive, which is the second key factor that we identified in as an important factor, as a key factor for aligning for effective crisis management that also pushes forward the green and just transition in the EU. The ongoing green backlash in the EU's agri-food sector, for instance, demonstrates how a lack of a common narrative can lead to a rejection of the EU-level strategy formulated by the European Commission. In this case, the farm to fork strategy, which can in turn result in a significant obstacle for the EU green transition, for the EU's green transition in a particular sector, and also as a whole, as we currently are seeing in the EU's agri-food sector. This need for inclusiveness also extends to national interest, as the failure to overcome national differences in the initial stages of the energy crisis and also during the COVID-19 pandemic triggered a strong nation-first reflex, which in turn undermined an effective crisis response that was aligned with the Green Deal. Then finally, a third key factor that we identify in our paper for effective crisis responses aligned with the EU's green agenda, besides EU leadership and inclusiveness, are strong capacities. That is to say, capacities at EU level to act and decide in response to crisis, such as, for instance, showcased during the global financial crisis or the sovereign debt crisis, with where supranational action like the bond buying program of the European Central Bank was vital at the height of the debt crisis to resolve the debt crisis. During the pandemic, common borrowing as part of Next Generation EU also proved crucial, as it allowed member states with less fiscal maneuverability to also provide the necessary support to citizens and businesses to ultimately provide a constructive way out of the pandemic during the lockdowns. At the same time, our findings also show that strong capacities won't amount to much without the necessary strategic vision. For instance, the introduction of the European semester during the sovereign debt crisis in the 2010s strengthened supranational surveillance over member states' fiscal policies, but nothing was really done by the Commission to leverage this newfound power as a tool to install incentives for greening the national public spending of member states. So this points to a strong interdependence between these three aspects of inclusiveness, capacities, and also EU leadership, which must be bolstered in tandem to fully align EU crisis management with the Green Deal. Next slide, please. So based on these findings, we then formulate several policy recommendations ahead of the EU elections. So first of all, to leverage EU leadership and ensure that the Green Deal continues to be the overarching strategic vision for EU policy also in the next institutional cycle. Our first proposal is the adoption of a Green Deal contingency plan, which would assess the main challenges, issues, and risks, and the expected implications of crisis for the green transition. And this plan would also then consider the measures necessary to keep the Green Deal on track and explore synergies to use the polycrisis on the one hand to accelerate the Green Deal, and on the other hand, employ the strategic vision of the Green Deal to accelerate the way out of an ongoing crisis. In addition to this Green Deal contingency plan, we also propose the establishment of an advisory body on green and just crisis management, which would be tasked with forecasting forecasting for Green Deal objectives in light of ongoing or possible future crises, and look at how and basically look to improve the crisis preparedness of the Green Deal itself. In the event of a major international crisis, this advisory body would then develop guidelines to align EU level and national crisis responses with climate goals, and also seek to maximize synergies and minimize trade-offs between short-term effectiveness and the green agenda. This mechanism would complement and also help mainstream the green agenda into the activities of existing mechanisms for crisis governance at EU level, such as, for instance, the integrated political crisis response mechanism of the Council, the single market emergency instrument, and also, for instance, the European food security crisis preparedness and response mechanism. Then the second set of recommendations focuses on fostering inclusiveness in EU crisis management, which we identified as second key factor for more effective crisis management in line with the Green Deal in these times of public crisis. The first recommendation we make here is for the EU to develop a strategy for communicating the importance of the Green Deal in the current age of the public crisis, which would help inform Europeans about the socioeconomic benefits of the green transition, but also of the costs of inaction. And this communication strategy should also communicate clearly and consistently regarding all the uncertainties, trade-offs and costs related to the green transition, and how these are distributed across society and the EU's economy. And in encountering crisis, this strategy should focus on the concrete benefits of personal choices that citizens can make in line with Green Deal objectives, such as, for instance, during the energy crisis, where energy savings could help relieve on an individual level European citizens by lowering their electricity and gas bills, and on the other hand, also helped to decouple the EU further from the Russian gas supplies. Further to foster inclusiveness in EU crisis management, the EU should also initiate strategic dialogues with member states, regions, cities, consumer associations, industry, and NGOs to address the fundamental concerns and socioeconomic challenges of people and businesses concerning the Green Deal in the age of public crisis. Further to the recent strategic dialogue on the future of EU agriculture, which was established in January. And together with this communication strategy, these strategic dialogues would help to cultivate a shared assessment of the public crisis across the EU, and also foster a joint narrative across the Union regarding the green and just transition. And we believe that together, this common understanding would make it easier for the EU to formulate collective responses to crisis, to short-term crises that we have seen in the past years, and will probably continue to see, that are aligned with EU climate goals. Then finally, the final set of recommendations to reinforce capacities in EU crisis management. We propose, we argue that the debate on a follow-up mechanism to the recovery and resilience facility should be initiated immediately after the EU elections, because the RRF will of course be phased out in 2026, and this risks leaving a huge gap in a huge funding gap for green investments at EU level. And this must be the debate must be urgently initiated to strengthen EU-level budgetary capacities to navigate the polycrisis in line with net zero ambitions. We believe that in the current context, with the endless succession of overlapping crises and the structural long-term need for investment in the green transition, that this justifies a permanent instrument to replace the RRF. This could similarly be financed via joint borrowing. However, instead of being a priori redistributive and directed mainly towards national projects like the RRF, this new instrument should focus much more on strategic European projects with a much stronger cross-border dimension, such as, for instance, a renewable infrastructure project. But this could also, for instance, include EU education programs for net zero skills, for skills for net zero industries as part of the Green Deal Industrial Plan. And in addition to this instrument, to this new financial instrument at the EU level, to ensure to safeguard green investment and to safeguard public green investment in the green transition, we also argue, what should also be done is for the EU to mobilize funds from other sources. For instance, by mainstreaming the green agenda in the European semester, and also by continuing work on the sustainable finance agenda to leverage private sources of funding for the green transition. And so together, these policy recommendations should leverage these three aspects of EU leadership, inclusiveness, and capacities, which would in turn allow for more effective crisis management in these times of polycrisis, but also for crisis responses that are aligned with our long-term strategic objectives under the Green Deal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm gonna move on to the discussion part of the webinar, and I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can see all of your faces. So yeah, if there's any questions from the audience, now is the time. Doesn't seem like there's any questions. So from my side, I may start the discussion asking about that imbalance in the pillars of the Green Deal that you mentioned in your presentation, Éloi. I was wondering how can policies in the upcoming tenure can be developed that effectively addresses these issues, but also including concepts of sustainable well-being and sufficiency, as this is a webinar on ToBe. I'm going to include that topic in there. So that's a question for the both of you if you want to answer, but for Éloi, because this is his presentation there.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. How do you integrate the question of sustainable well-being in the Green Deal? So, for instance, if you look at the question of sufficiency and the focus right now of the European Green Deal on material efficiency, there is the report by the International Resource Panel that shows that, contrary to common belief, material efficiency at the global level is actually declining. That is, we are actually consuming more and more natural resources to produce the same amount of economic output. If you look at material efficiency in the EU, in the last 20 years, it has basically stalled. That is, we made almost no progress when it comes to material efficiency. Now, if you integrate this, so you might, if you just focus on climate and energy, you don't see this, okay? But if you look at the original text from December 2019 of the European Green Deal, there's not just climate and energy. There is also this focus on material efficiency, okay? And so my understanding is that because we have not factor in the question of sufficiency, we are having this problem with the use of natural resources, which are not at all sustainable in the EU. So if you introduce in there a question of sustainable well-being, that is, well-being which is compatible with planetary boundaries, you have the need to have sufficiency on top of efficiency. So that's one aspect of it, which is to, via sufficiency, factor in this question of sustainable well-being. But there are others. If you think that sustainable well-being has to do with the preservation of biodiversity and ecosystems and not just a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and that human well-being is actually connected to the well-being of non-humans, you also need to take care of biodiversity and ecosystems. And biodiversity is basically collapsing in the EU as elsewhere in the world. So if you just take human well-being as let's reduce greenhouse gas emission because climate crisis is going to affect, for instance, human health, and you don't take care of biodiversity and ecosystems, in the end, you will have a major problem when it comes to human well-being, because human well-being is sustained and supported by the health of biodiversity and ecosystems. So I think in the end, it's not just a question of carbon sinks, it's the whole equilibrium, the whole bet on this new model of development that the European Green Deal is supposed to be. It has to be balanced. And for food and agriculture, it's the same thing. You cannot just reason in terms of the amount of food. Well, first of all, you have a huge food insecurity in the EU. So it seems that it's not just a problem of, how sustainable the agriculture model is today, but it's also not providing enough food basically to Europeans. So you have a problem of how we distribute the food, how we waste the food, etc., how we share the food, all right? So this social dimension, but then in the end, if the industrial agriculture model basically leads to a complete collapse of ecosystems and soils, it's going to be completely unsustainable also. So I think, again, the advantage, the benefits of having a view which is more balanced of the Green Deal than just zero net emissions is that you understand that it's actually this balanced view which in the end sustain the very objective of climate energy. It's not going to be achieved if we only focus on this objective, basically.
Thank you very much. I see that I believe Mr. Tuhi has his hand raised. No.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Tuhi.
I'm Tuuli Hirvilammi, and great that you give me yes, okay. Anyway, thanks for your great presentations. So my questions goes first to Éloi. What would be, you mentioned some social ecological policies like job guarantee, universal basic services. I saw there. Do you have any other examples in mind to concretize what, for example, should be on the agenda of European policymakers in the coming years? And then for Simon, I would like to hear your view on the future of the European Green Deal. Éloi was quite optimistic and did not share this pessimistic atmosphere now related to the upcoming EU elections as well. But as a policy specialist, what is your view? How do you see, is European Green Deal going to be resilient in the future as well? And do you see this, what Éloi, such EU Green Deal, what would it stand?
I think we didn't catch the last segment of your question, Julie.
Yeah, sorry, my internet is very unstable, but I wanted to hear whether maybe the last section. Yes, so what to do? Should we add the social dimension to EU Green Deal, and would that increase the resilience of EU Green Deal? I would like to hear Simon's view on this question as well.
So maybe I can start with the specific social ecological policies. I think there are two priorities. Well, there are many, many priorities in our world. This is a bit of a problem, you know, there are too many priorities. But there is one priority, which is the farming model. I'm not satisfied at all with, for instance, the deal that was concluded in France by the lobbies that claim to represent farmers in France, which are basically led by multimillionaire traders on commodities global markets, not at all by small farmers who are not being represented at all in this negotiation. And the negotiation was concluded that, well, the government is going to basically lift a number of environmental regulation, and then the farmers are supposed to be happy. But they are not happy at all, because none of the questions that they were asking has been answered, starting with the stability of their income. And so we need this shift to agroecology. We need this shift to, and we need to engineer this shift. And you know probably truly that the common agriculture policy does the exact opposite of that. It actually gives incentives to more production and more industrial agriculture, and that only 8% of all agriculture, all farms in the EU are organic agriculture. And we have studies in France that show that agroecology basically is better in terms, of course, of preserving ecosystems and biodiversity, but also the income, actually, of farmers, that it actually yields higher income and more stability to their income. And so for that, you need a sort of social ecological transition of the whole food and farming system. And one of the things that is happening in France right now is the emergence of what is called the food social security. And the food social security is to say, we have this problem of food insecurity, we have this problem of those unreliable global supply chains, which are environmentally harmful. Why not have systems where people are given allotment to actually buy good organic products, which are grown locally? And that this is one of the functions of a new social security, which is not to protect, let's say, the health or the income of people, but to grant them access to food security and good food security, not just food, but good food, which is, of course, the whole question of how cheap very bad food is today and how much is being subsidized. You are seeing now experiments in France in a number of cities with this food social security. I think is a very promising social ecological policy. Another one, of course, is to mitigate energy poverty, because at this moment it's affecting I don't know how many tens of millions of Europeans, and it's completely unsustainable. And so this is a key area, of course, renovating houses and homes so that you lower energy poverty and you allow people to live in a relatively secure environment, because they are not subject to volatile energy prices. And a third area is to protect people from ecological shocks and to build social ecological protection in the sense of, for instance, protecting the elderly from heat waves. We have in Europe, as you know, climate crisis is twice as fast in Europe as it is in the rest of the world. The idea that we live in a temperate region which is relatively unaffected by the climate crisis is a complete illusion. Climate crisis is going twice as fast in Europe as it is in the rest of the world. And so it means that we have huge ecological shocks and climate shocks, and heat waves is one of them. And we don't have right now a good form of social protection against the effect of heat waves, which is already killing tens of thousands of people each year in the EU. For instance, the heat wave of 2022 killed 70,000 people in Europe, almost as much as the 2003 heat wave. And we are not ready for that. So those three examples, food social security, combating energy poverty, and protecting people against heat waves are, I think, good example of the kind of social ecological policies that we should be implementing urgently in the EU.
Simon?
Sure, yeah. So regarding the first question, well, I would say that I would maybe hold a slightly more pessimistic view than Éloi, as I don't consider the green backlash among EU citizens, whether now, or the extent to which it exists, as the only challenge for the Green Deal during the next political cycle. But because there's now also competing concerns over economic security and military security, and in these areas there are also clear trade-offs with the green transition, with the EU's green and just transition. For instance, in the case of economic security, in the current context where we are decoupling from Russian energy supplies, from Russian gas mainly, we need to invest in large new LNG import infrastructure to make this possible, and this of course complicates the complete phase out of fossil fuels in the short term. And then in the case of military security, in the case of defense, which is now also emerging on the European policy agenda, I think there is now broad consensus that across the EU, member states need to invest in their militaries. But of course, then with the scarce resources that we have, this of course results in less financing for the green transition. So there are clear trade-offs, and these come in addition to the green backlash, which I think means a much more challenging environment for the Green Deal going forward. And then to the second question as to what I think should be the place of social objectives in the green transition. Well, I would definitely say that the integration of social considerations is crucial to make the Green Deal work. For instance, in the energy sector, a lot of the focus under Repower EU to accelerate the clean energy transition has been on accelerating permitting procedures for renewable energy projects, but this has often amounted to bypassing EU environmental legislation. But this can of course result in local protests and ultimately court cases, which then of course result, these lengthy court cases can of course result in a lot of these and a lot of legal troubles for these renewable energy projects, which will in turn slow down the clean energy transition as a whole. So to give just a concrete example of how I see these aspects interacting. So I definitely say that aligning the clean energy transition and the green transition more broadly with social objectives will be crucial to make it work. So and a way that can be done, for instance, in the clean energy transition, is not to focus our efforts on accelerating permitting by bypassing environmental legislation or by reducing the opportunities for citizens to have their voice heard in these procedures, but rather to focus on the digitalization of permitting procedures in national administrations, or for instance by harmonizing them across borders, which also still remains a big problem in the EU today. So that's where our efforts should be focused, to really align social and environmental and climate objectives.
I have a question for you, Simon, as well. The study that you presented hasn't been published for a very long time, but I just was wondering whether you already have an initial response from European policymakers and whether it's positive or negative of the recommendations that you presented.
Well, we had, I would say, generally a positive response, but yeah, this is still also something that we are still continue to push today. So we are continuing talks with policymakers to also hear their feedback and to further also develop our recommendation, because this is not these are of course not set in stone, and we of course also remain are very much focused on really developing these more in the context of the upcoming EU elections, to really ensure that we can keep the Green Deal alive during the next 5 years.
Before we leave, I want to also let you know that the recording of the last session is available online. You can click on the link in this slide or check the ToBe website, and that there's a last webinar to this session, which is the 29th of May. The registration link is the same as the one for this session, so no need to register, but just so you know that we will be back on the 29th of May at 2 p.m. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good rest of your afternoon and see you soon.